this is not a capture Maduro type event that seems to land on us out of nowhere just as we're coming back from the holidays. This is a long-running trend that all of a sudden has an extremely sympathetic symbol of sort of what has gone wrong. And so I'm inclined to think that, is this going to be Americans' number one issue in November of 2026? No. Like, I mean, I doubt it. Whatever. I have no idea what's going to happen between now and then. Will this, I think, become emblematic of like the withdrawal from Afghanistan when really the bottom started to fall out for Biden, for example? I am inclined to think that it's possible. Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk. Call this something of an emergency podcast. I'd planned on airing an episode setting the table for the 2026 midterms today, but we're going to save that for another day. Because on Saturday, a federal immigration officer in Minneapolis shot and killed Alex Pretti, a 37-year-old ICU nurse at the Veterans Affairs Hospital. It's the second killing by a federal immigration officer in Minneapolis in less than 3 weeks. The first being Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother who was shot while impeding traffic as part of a protest. We're going to get into some of the details of what happened on Saturday, but I think it's fair to say that the public, many lawmakers, and even some Republicans have lost patience with the Trump administration's immigration enforcement tactics. In both killings in Minneapolis, the Trump administration rushed to brand Good and Pretti as domestic terrorists and fabricated events despite the shootings being visible in multiple videos. While there was plenty of pushback amongst Democrats, independents, and the press in the case of Good, this time a handful of Republicans, including the NRA, have joined the pushback as well. As listeners well know, it's going to take a minute before we can fully understand the impact of this weekend on American politics. But we'll share what we know in this moment. And so here with me to do that is head of research at 50+1, Mary Radcliffe. Welcome to the podcast, Mary.
Hey, Galen. It's good to be here, although the topic is a little grim.
Yes, indeed. Also here with us is managing editor at VoteBeat, Nathaniel Rakich. Welcome, Nathaniel.
Hey, Galen. Hope you guys both, made it through the storm okay.
Yeah. I'm looking at a lot of snow, but survived in one piece. Thank you for asking, and likewise. So we're going to get into the data and political reactions in a second, but to start, I'll say that I have the impression from existing online that Alex Pretti's killing feels like it has the potential to be a turning point. I can say a little bit more about that, but I want to ask you guys first, sort of check my priors. Nathaniel, Mary, do you get that sense as well?
I do get that sense, and I obviously want to qualify that with the fact that it is very much a gut decision, and this is a data-based podcast, and we'll get into the data in a bit, but it did feel like people had kind of said enough is enough. And I think that the best data, quote unquote, for that is, I think, the statements from a lot of Republicans. Obviously, we know that Republicans have basically gone along with Donald Trump on almost everything, 98% of what he has wanted to do. And so I think it is notable anytime that you see a Republican kind of criticize him. And I think we saw a couple of statements, including crucially not from the Lisa Murkowskis of the world, the kind of more moderate Republicans, but from people like Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt, who was basically called the shooting a tragedy and said, what is the goal right now? Is it to deport every single non-U.S. citizen? I don't think that's what Americans want. You saw Max Miller, who's a fairly MAGA-y congressman from Ohio, calling for a full investigation and saying they're, quote, serious unanswered questions. So to me, I think that the fact that in this case, there may be many reasons for why, maybe this one is broken through. I think that in this case, the video, I think, is so important. And the video here seemed pretty clear in a way that with the Renee Good video, people were slicing and dicing it. You could kind of read into it what you wanted. This one seems pretty undeniable. And I think it does take, on the Republican side, a lot of cognitive dissonance to be like, yeah, everything was fine here. And so you're seeing some Republicans kind of bump up against the limit of how far they are willing to go to defend Trump. And so I think from that, I am getting the sense that there may be some actual juice behind reform, or at least like a turning point, the nation turning against increased immigration enforcement. But obviously, there's a lot of time for that. The natural parallel to me, this is maybe a little bit weird, is January 6th. which was the other time that really Republicans seemed to say, listen, enough is enough. And obviously with that, they ended up kind of having some selective memory and pedaled back a lot of their criticism only like a couple months later.
Yeah, that's the issue for me. When I think about whether this is a turning point or not, my question is like, what does a turning point actually mean? Does that mean that, okay, maybe attitudes change a little bit? Maybe we're hearing some more statements from Republicans saying that they think something has gone wrong or awry in the administration's approach to immigration enforcement. But the question is, does anything actually happen? And I think January 6th is a great parallel for that, Nathaniel, because the answer was no, nothing happened, right? Like, they did not successfully impeach, they impeached, but they did not successfully remove Trump from office. They took no real actions other than prosecuting people who committed offenses during those riots. But like, there was no fundamental
and they were
change.
pardoned.
And then, well, yeah, I mean, that's 4 years later, right? I'm not thinking about a 4-year timeline right now, but
yeah.
I guess for me, I don't really understand what a turning point is unless someone is suggesting something to turn to, which frankly, I don't know that we are seeing from these kinds of statements from Republicans, right? Like, you look at statements from Republican senators, for example, there's been at least 6 Republican senators that I have seen calling for investigations into this shooting. And like you said, Nathaniel, it's not all of your like expected folks, right? Like, yes, you've got Collins and Murkowski, but also Pete Ricketts of Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
Just perhaps a surprising name for me. McCormick, my senator here in Pennsylvania, has called for investigations. So yes, they're saying some words, but like calling for investigations is not really like some fundamental shift necessarily in policy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think obviously there are multiple definitions for what a turning point could be. I could see another obvious potential parallel is kind of the George Floyd murder and then protests, which also, of course, coincidentally happened in Minneapolis. I could see this kicking off another big protest movement. And, you could, I think, credibly say, like, okay, protests, but like, what is that actually going to change? I also think the important thing is the fact that the government funding is going to expire on Friday. And this incident does seem to have made a number of moderate Democratic senators whose support would be needed to fund the government say, I'm not going to fund any DHS bill that is funding ICE at this level.
Chuck Schumer had a statement to that
right.
effect that Democrats would not support the funding package unless it stripped out the DHS funding.
Right. So I think that the odds of a government shutdown have increased. And I think given the softness that you're maybe seeing among some of these Republican senators, I wonder if you could actually see that funding get decreased, which would obviously be a tangible policy win for the left in this case. So I think there are a couple of different, and then, I guess like the dream scenario for, liberals would be that, the backlash is so strong that Trump himself actually kind of like caves and withdraws, the troops from Minneapolis. I don't really see that happening, but we should be open-minded.
Yeah, a couple of things on that. We'll get more into the prospect of a partial government shutdown. Of course, there was a lot of funding in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. As we discussed on the last podcast of 2025, those funds would still be available for immigration enforcement, even if the current funding bill being considered changes. And when it comes to Trump, he did an interview with the Wall Street Journal Sunday evening where he said the administration is reviewing everything and acknowledged that at some point, immigration enforcement officers will leave Minneapolis, which seems to be a little bit less of a defiant stance than the administration was in the case of Renee Good. But I want to maybe put some info behind why I'm thinking this could be a potential turning point and what the parallels might be for me. I mean, longtime listeners of this podcast and its forebearer know that I was pretty clear-eyed about the political repercussions of the Biden administration's handling of the border crisis and immigration enforcement from 2021 to 2025. And I think it is quite clear that in some ways the Biden administration itself and how they responded to that crisis radicalized Americans on the issue of immigration, right? Building the border wall was never popular during Trump's 2016 campaign, during his entire first term. By and large, Americans saw immigration as more of a net positive than a net negative. I think seeing the border crisis and the consequences more broadly made Americans start to side more with the hardline Trump view on immigration. And that has endured to some extent up until the most recent polling, where Americans still trust Republicans more than Democrats on the issue of immigration. We're going to see if that changes now. And we'll get into that polling in a second, despite the fact that they have soured quite a bit on Trump's handling on immigration when it's more of a referendum on Trump as opposed to a choice between Democrats and Republicans. But I think when I talk about turning, and look, that turning point mattered. I think it was quite visible that by the summer of 2022, the combination of inflation plus an increasing sense that there was a crisis when it came to the border and immigration turned the public quite squarely against the incumbent administration. Now, I have a sense that Trump's administration and their immigration enforcement tactics may be radicalizing Americans in the other direction. So, turning points can happen more than once. In a sense, I think we turned in 2022. We may be turning again in the sense that Americans will no longer support the more hardline immigration enforcement tactics. And in the same way that probably the Biden administration did a significant disservice to people who have more permissive attitudes about immigration, I have the sense that this moment is going to do quite a disservice to people in American politics who want more hardline immigration tactics. We can get into broader politics later on, but in some sense, because both administrations have not offered anything resembling what Americans actually want or say they want in polls, they end up radicalizing the public in ways that ultimately probably don't serve their goals.
Yeah, I mean, I recall saying multiple times during the 2024 election period on podcasts that the Republicans are further to the right than Americans overall on immigration, and Democrats are further to the left than Americans overall on immigration. And I think that's exactly what is happening. We saw during the Biden administration the further left policies that people did not like. We see now these harder line stances that people really do not like. Like, there is a middle ground here, and I think there's a potential for someone to step in and take that position and potentially do quite well with it, because we've seen two different extremes and Americans are pretty unhappy with both of them.
Yeah, so let's take that step back now and ask the question of how Americans view Trump's handling of immigration overall. There are a lot of nuances here, but the good news is you guys are both really good at reading polling and imbuing it with nuance. So, Mary, I think this is probably your purview. Why don't you start us off by describing the public opinion landscape?
So just the broad picture, like if you look at overall approval of Trump's handling of immigration, I looked at the strength in numbers polling average on this because strength in numbers does this really, I think, useful thing, which separates out questions that ask about immigration from those that ask about deportation specifically. So there's like a separate polling trend for approval of Trump's handling of immigration and approval of Trump's handling of deportations. So Trump is underwater by 9 points on his handling of immigration in the strength in numbers average. On deportations, he's underwater by 11 points. And both of those have fallen in recent weeks. I mean, he's been underwater for months, but they've both fallen enough to see it on the chart in recent weeks. Now,
basically, after Renee Good's killing.
That's right. I do want to flag, though, that this is still among his better issues. Overall, in the 50+1 polling average, Trump is underwater by 17 points. And that's using the same model and architecture that the strength in numbers averages are, because both are produced by Elliot Morris. So even though we've had all this chaos, this remains among Trump's best issues. ICE is further underwater than Trump. So I took a look at polling conducted in January asking about favorability of ICE, so whether people had a favorable or unfavorable opinion. I only used the most recent poll from each pollster because there were a number of pollsters that asked the question more than once during January. And on average, ICE is underwater by 14 points in those polls. But even that 14 points underwater still doesn't meet Trump's overall approval. So I think that's an interesting wrinkle that people don't like Trump's handling of immigration. They don't like ICE, but they disapprove of Trump more overall than on this issue. So that may be an indication that sort of the economic malaise and the cost of living stuff is still driving Trump's approval more than this in this chaos.
Yeah, I think that's certainly right. Obviously, though, if immigration is the one thing kind of like buoying you above water, you don't want to lose people on it because then the bottom really could fall out on it. I think, Galen, you used the exact right word, which is nuance. And I'm just trying to keep a very open mind and be very cautious about this because I think also to me, it's not clear to me that Americans would necessarily think about this issue, about these shootings, when they are answering a question about approval rating on immigration, right? Because I think it is perfectly valid for Americans to be like, yeah, well, I think that, you should have strong border security and you should have even strong immigration enforcement within the country and more deportations, but they shouldn't be shooting people. So I'm not sure the degree to which this will affect that. I guess it sounds like the Renee Good shooting did affect it, but correlation isn't causation.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, Nathaniel, if you like look a little closer at some of the questions that are trying to get more at this issue about enforcement activity, there's a number of pollsters that have been asking a version of this question. Do you think Donald Trump or the Trump administration has gone too far, has been about right, or not gone far enough when it comes to immigration enforcement, deporting immigrants living in the United States illegally? There's lots of ways people ask this question. But broadly speaking, across different pollsters, the responses look fairly similar. So, for example, from CNN's January poll, 52%, a majority of Americans say that Trump has gone too far when it comes to deporting immigrants living in the United States illegally. 31% say it's been about right, and 16% say not gone far enough. But 52% saying gone too far is quite a lot.
Yeah.
And when you drill down into looking at this by partisan identity, even among independents, the swingiest voters, you see 57% saying gone too far. So even higher than the overall numbers. So I think there is some nuance here where Republicans certainly still support deporting everyone living here illegally in poll after poll. But Americans are looking at what they're seeing and they're saying this is too much. And this is before this news of this weekend.
Exactly right. And I think that, to be clear, I do think that the evidence is pretty clear that Americans don't even, if Renee Good and Alex Pretti were still alive, I think the evidence is pretty clear that Americans don't support the degree to which Trump has cracked down on immigration. And we knew this, frankly, even before the 2024 election, right? We knew that in polls, Americans were like, yeah, violent criminals, get them out of here, which is what Trump was saying on the campaign trail. But obviously, he's gone a lot farther than that. And even before the 2024 election, when Americans were very much in a very conservative mood on immigration, they were still saying, yeah, find a path to citizenship for the, undocumented immigrants who are, not nonviolent criminals.
Especially if the more attributes you give them, the more people support finding a pathway to citizenship rather than deportation. Nonviolent, been here for a long time, pay their taxes. Every attribute you get, support for keeping them goes up.
Right. And this is why immigration is obviously such a nuanced issue. And it is tricky when talking about which party has the advantage on it, because I think that different parties, to you guys' point earlier, some of the aspects of the Republican platform are popular, like the border enforcement, and then some parts of the Democratic platform are popular, like finding a path to citizenship.
Yeah, polling is pretty tricky on that. I mean, I will say that there were polls in the final months of the 2024 election that showed Americans supporting deportation of everyone living in the country illegally. But it also often comes down to what choices do you give people in a poll. And actually, I want to ask about how Alex Pretti's killing might change all of this. But maybe we can start with how Renee Good's killing changed some of this. The New York Times did a very good piece. It was Ruth Egelnick, friend of the pod, along with Christian Jang, who wrote this story called Why Polls About the Killing of Renee Good Are So Hard to Parse. And they go through the three reasons that they give are that the questions about whether or not the shooting was justified spanned a spectrum of different ways of asking and how much context you gave, and got very different answers. For example, in some polls, Americans were evenly split about how justified the shooting was. For example, when the choices were the woman killed was mostly responsible for her shooting because she was threatening towards ICE agents. 43% of Americans agree with that. When you give them the option of the agent acted irresponsibly and was never really in danger, 44% of Americans agree with that. When you just ask sort of outright, was this justified or not justified, the shooting of the Minneapolis woman by an ICE agent, 28% of Americans said justified, 54% of Americans said not justified. they go on down in terms of other nuances and that polls can skew towards the highly engaged. In one Quinnipiac poll, which actually we cited on this podcast when I talked to Lenny Bronner about it, 82% of Americans said they had seen the video footage of the ICE shooting, but there's reasons to believe that Quinnipiac was reaching a more engaged part of the electorate, and that, in fact, 82% of Americans have not seen the video. That was the sort of second nuance that they brought in. And then
which, to be clear, is not a knock on Quinnipiac. That's just people who take polls tend to be more engaged.
Yeah. And there are ways to try to mitigate this. But
Quinnipiac's particular methodology might have that problem be even more exacerbated.
Okay.
But anyway.
And then lastly, the other issue they bring up is that questions that provoke partisan gut reactions leave out more nuanced views. So when you ask, should the United States abolish ICE or not abolish ICE, you're provoking a partisan response. It's pretty clear sort of which side is left, which side is right. And that may end up meaning different things to different people. But post Renee Good's shooting, is it clear how much of that had changed or where America was just post Renee Good?
So I mentioned at the top that you can see some decrease in Trump's net approval on immigration in the last few weeks, so since Renee Good's killing. The New York Times story that you're citing here, Galen, did pull out some interesting questions from YouGov that were asked after Renee Good's shooting that really picked at specifics about what people might want to see with ICE in the future. And I think that is probably the better version of this polling than just like, do you want to abolish ICE? Yes, no. So in that YouGov poll, there were 7 different specific policy items that they asked if Americans would support. So, for example, you see net support of 51 points for creating stricter recruitment requirements for ICE agents. You see, by 12 points, people do not want to keep ICE in its current form. But there's a bunch of different kinds of ways of getting at this. So I think what that polling shows is in the post Renee Good shooting environment, people are looking at ICE fairly critically. But it's a little more difficult, I think, to look at hey, in the few weeks prior to that event, how were people looking at ICE? Because we don't necessarily have the polls that were drilling into these topics just before then.
Yeah. And, I know we're getting sort of in the weeds here and being quite wonky on an issue that can feel very sort of visceral and emotional. And I'll just acknowledge that we're talking about human lives here. To take it a step further, an addendum to that story was Data for Progress tried to drill down on what Americans mean when they say that they're open to abolishing ICE, because this got play on this podcast and in across the political landscape, that for the first time since YouGov had been polling this question, they found a plurality of Americans open to eliminating ICE. Data for Progress, which is a progressive polling outfit, tried to figure out what Americans mean when they say that. And the options that they gave were: abolish ICE means that ICE should be fully eliminated as a federal agency along with all of its functions. The next option was: abolish ICE means that ICE should be fully eliminated as a federal agency and its functions and funding should be reallocated to other existing agencies. Then the third option is: abolish ICE means that ICE should be replaced with a new immigration enforcement agency that is more functional. Now, a majority of Republicans say abolishing ICE means getting rid of the agency and all of its functions. But when you ask Democrats, who are the ones who, tend to support this more than anyone else, they're split a third. So to a third of Democrats, it means getting rid of all of the functions. I guess this is the most permissive of Democrats would say get rid of immigration enforcement in many ways. A third say that the funding should be reallocated to existing agencies. And a third say that create a new agency that is more functional. So I think that adds a lot of needed context to this broader conversation about people saying abolish ICE, don't abolish ICE, whatnot.
Right. And I think this is obviously a really important question going forward, because I think you are obviously as we are seeing in the data and in the real world, you are seeing more backlash to ICE and to increased immigration enforcement. And I think it's a really interesting and important question, like how Americans are going to react to that, and whether Democrats in particular. Obviously, there's going to be pressure from the progressive side to, you've already seen, some more progressive people, even not that progressive people, or people you don't think of as, Bernie Sanders and AOC, say that we should abolish ICE. But it's like, what does that mean, and how are Americans going to react to it? And I don't think you can look at those polling. So, like, for instance, like YouGov had a poll, like a flash poll in the immediate aftermath of the Alex Pretti shooting that found the support for abolishing ICE at 46% versus 41% opposition. So it is now, at least on paper, popular to abolish ICE. But I think, Galen, both Galen and Mary, both of the more nuanced polling that you just cited shows that it's not necessarily true that Americans agree with kind of what AOC thinks of. Actually, I don't know what AOC thinks of when she says abolish ICE, so I shouldn't put words in her mouth. But like I guess maybe I should say the like Republican caricature of abolishing ICE, which is just like, let's get rid of all immigration enforcement. I don't think that is what Americans are saying that they support. But I also think like there are nuanced ways to make this argument to the American people, because obviously they are receptive to it, but it isn't necessarily going to be, not everybody's going to agree on it. So I think basically breaking news, like without anything else, it's easy to be against something. It's harder to come up with a policy, like a concrete solution that everybody can agree with.
Yeah, I think Democrats have this tendency to like have these slogans that indicate action items that are really vague, like like abolish ICE.
Well, I was just going to say defund the police.
Right.
Yeah, and I think
that's
that actually is something of a trap for them. Because if you have these slogans that indicate action items, but the action items are vaguely defined, then the opposition to your party has the opportunity to shape that into whatever they want it to be, right? You can see in the Data for Progress poll, as Galen said, that a majority of Republicans believe that abolish ICE means basically getting rid of immigration enforcement in the interior of this nation, which 2/3 of Democrats don't think that's what it means. So I think that is like a trap that Democrats like to put themselves into. Whereas if you think about like the big Republican slogans over the last decade, it's "Make America Great Again," which means nothing at all.
Today's podcast is brought to you by you, the listeners. Without paid subscribers, GD Politics wouldn't exist. Your support means that we can continue making an independent podcast and cover difficult news like today's news in a rigorous and curious way. Paid subscribers get about twice the number of episodes and can join the paid subscriber chat. You can also connect your personal feed to your favorite podcast player so you get the full version of every episode wherever you listen to podcasts. Support us in 2026 by becoming a paid subscriber at gdpolitics.com. I did want to bring up the defund the police slogan because we were looking for historical parallels before. And you also mentioned, Nathaniel, that there was a spectrum of Democrats who are getting behind the abolish ICE idea, including, I mentioned on a previous podcast, Ruben Gallego, who is seen as more of, as far as Democrats go, somewhat hawkish on the border, being a senator from Arizona. And defund the police felt appropriate for many Democrats in leadership positions during the George Floyd protests in a way that Democrats later came to regret. When we're talking about where we go from here in the aftermath of Alex Pretti's shooting, I have a sense that both there will be an increasing intensity of opposition to ICE and that there will also be a bunch of Democrats who remember what happened with defund the police. Mm-hmm. So my question is, maybe unknowable, but how do we know whether we're in one of those moments where emotions run high, things that feel appropriate now may bite you in the ass later?
Yeah, to your point, Galen, I think we're already seeing that because I think you've seen there was an article, I think maybe a week ago, so after Renee Good's shooting, that was about like all the high-profile Democrats who are actively saying, hey guys, let's not say abolish ICE. There's in addition to the anger that is surging on the left to say, yes, let's abolish ICE, there's also been, I think, a pretty strong backlash against that because, I think they are really terrified of getting tagged with this again in an election. To your question about whether we know we're in that moment, obviously, we don't. You need the benefit of hindsight for that. One thing that I think is a potentially instructive comparison point, though, is like polling of gun control issues after school shootings, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is something that we have, unfortunately, a lot of data about. And we wrote about this far too often at 538, which was that in the aftermath of big school shootings or mass shootings in general, like Las Vegas or the Pulse shooting, support for gun control measures goes up. And you might even see some legislative action on that front. So, going back to the conversation about turning points. But in the polling, after the shooting fades from the headlines and people kind of like forget about it after a couple of months, it tends to settle back down at the baseline that it was at before. So I think that it is quite plausible that you could see the same type of thing happen. I think that any polling taken in the immediate aftermath of people, watching this terrifying video of Alex Pretti's shooting is liable to get a lot of people have an emotional reaction to it and say, yes, we should abolish ICE, or, we should tamp down immigration enforcement. It is no guarantee that that is going to hold going forward, right? Thermostatic public opinion, like it giveth and it taketh, as we mentioned, and we don't know what the environment's going to be in the 2028 election. It's definitely possible that somebody takes an abolish ICE position now that then, becomes the subject of ads when J.D. Vance is running against them in August of 2028. That said, I'm not obviously advocating for one position or the other. I think as the polling shows, even before these shootings, there was a lot of discontent with the degree of immigration enforcement. And I think that there are ways to market it to Americans that are going to be more popular, and then there are ways to market it to Americans that are less popular. This essentially the same policies. And I'm thinking about some of the statements that we saw from moderate Democratic senators like Jackie Rosen, Catherine Cortez Masto after Pretti's shooting that said, I'm not going to support this government funding bill with the current levels of immigration enforcement funding. Nowhere in those statements did it say abolish ICE, but it had a lot of those same sentiments.
Yeah, and I think what Democrats are looking for when we look at the funding fight, they're not trying to abolish ICE in that funding fight. What they're trying to do is pass some guardrails around ICE's behavior, right? So, like, they're taking the reform ICE stance, at least as of now. Things like enforcing body cam requirements. They want to make it illegal for ICE to wear masks while they're doing enforcement operations. So things like that. They're looking
Stop pepper spraying.
Exactly. They're looking to put guardrails around the behavior of the organization rather than abolish ICE approach, at least as of now with a Republican in the White House.
Well, they're also looking for less funding, though, which is why, your point about slogans, defund could mean less funding. It could mean no funding. It's vague. So.
Yeah, I mean, they are looking for less funding. I guess I want to say I think that's a bit pretextual for the approach that they're taking right now in terms of this DHS funding bill, because we discussed before, and Galen mentioned earlier, there's like an enormous amount of funding for ICE that has already been passed in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so, whether or not they pass this DHS funding bill, ICE has got the money already.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So to add a little detail to what the debate is right now within the Democratic Party and, within the Senate over funding, the House has already passed the bill, but the United States is looking at a partial government shutdown if the Senate does not pass with 60 votes funding bills for health, education, labor, transportation programs, State Department, as well as the Department of Homeland Security, that is the housing agency for ICE. There's in particular $10 billion in this funding allocated to ICE. As we discussed on previous podcasts, there are several tens of billions of dollars and a more than 100% increase in ICE funding in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that is already available. And so earlier on, you heard Democrats saying, well, okay, we got some guardrails in this bill around ICE behavior, which is why we want to pass it, because even if we don't pass it, ICE will not be impeded in terms of its ability to perform its functions because it already can draw on all of that funding from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so you had a general sense, and there were, I think, 7 Democrats in the House who joined Republicans to pass this, more sort of the moderate type of Democrats, Jared Golden, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, for example. And I think there was a general sense that we were not headed towards another shutdown or partial shutdown because of that argument. Now, after Alex Pretti's shooting, the calculus has seemingly changed in that it doesn't matter. Those details don't matter so much anymore as, well, we have to do something. We have to show that we don't support this, or we're not going to get bogged down by some of these minor arguments. Something bigger needs to be done on immigration enforcement. And Susan Collins, for what it's worth, obviously she's not representing your median Republican in the Senate, but probably a key vote for whatever ends up happening ultimately, said, we're gonna see if we can break out even, the Department of Homeland Security funding or the ICE funding from the rest of these bills, try to pass the rest of these bills. Whereas in another environment, you might see Republicans saying, no, these are all staying together. We're not going to give you the opportunity to vote on these funding bills separately. And if Democrats want to say they don't support enforcing American immigration laws, they can put that on the record. That doesn't, well, I'm sure some Republicans will say that, but we're seeing a lot more tentativeness, I think, this right now than we would have otherwise seen.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you had asked me last week, are we going to see a shutdown next week, I would have said pretty definitively no. And if you ask me today, are we going to see a shutdown this week, my answer is, I'm not sure yet, or at least a partial shutdown.
Yeah. So at the very least, I think Americans' attention or political attention is going to be focused on immigration enforcement and Alex Pretti's killing in the near term, and this debate over the shutdown is going to focus folks' attention accordingly. But you said something early on in the conversation, Mary, that suggested you may have doubts about how enduring this conflict is when it gets to the midterms. You said that ultimately it is still likely the economy and inflation that is driving disapproval of Trump more than immigration. Do we think that this could change that and maybe change it in an enduring way? And the sort of more detailed questions are like, how much do Americans care about immigration today? Of the people who care a lot about immigration, who are those people? Are those people still Republicans, as we saw in, 2022? Or is it now Democrats who care a lot about immigration and might be voting on this issue as well?
Yeah, that depends a little bit on how you ask the question about what Americans care about.
If I had a nickel for every time I said that.
I want to say it is absolutely still in the mix as a high priority among Americans. So, for example, in Emerson College's January survey, when voters were asked from a list to pick the most important issue, immigration was in third place at 17%. Economy was still at the top at 32%, and threats to democracy was in second place at 24%. But immigration was the top issue, number one among Republican voters in that survey, 32% versus the economy at 30%. So this is absolutely still a concern that Americans care about, and among Republicans apparently care about quite a lot. There was also an interesting survey from Canadian pollster Angus Reid that was also conducted in January. A lot of pollsters did their Trump 1 year surveys in January, so we have a wealth of delicious January data to go through. This one I found really, really interesting because they asked, again, they had a list, and this is practically polling malpractice, but there's 17 issues on their long, long list of what are the most important issues facing Americans, which is a lot for respondents to read through. Respondents were able to pick up to 3 of those issues as their top priorities. But they had split out 2 issues that are dealing with the topics we're discussing today. One was immigration and border security, and the other was ICE enforcement actions in major cities. They included that as among the things people could select as their top issues. Interestingly to me, both of those things made it into the top 5 issues that Americans selected on this survey. So both of those things are things that people are caring about. And when you drill down a little bit more, those 2 issues among partisans, so people that identify as Republican or Democrat, not independents, the correctly partisan coded response was in the top 2 issues for all partisans. So Democrats' second place issue was ICE enforcement actions in major cities. And Republicans, they split off MAGA versus non-MAGA Republicans. Among MAGA Republicans, immigration and border security was tied for number 1. 50% of Republicans that identify as MAGA said that this is among their top 3 issues, along with cost of living and inflation. Among non-MAGA Republicans, it was their second place issue. All 3 had their top issue as cost of living and inflation. So while we do see that cost of living and inflation still topping the list sort of across the board, this stuff is really still playing among partisans. And the idea that the second most important issue to Democrats is ICE enforcement actions in major cities at this time means maybe this could end up having an impact. Now, on the other hand, you may recall, not even a month ago, we were here talking about how Trump's capture of Maduro in Venezuela was going to impact the midterms, and we've already memory holed that. So, I mean, my honest read on this situation in Minneapolis is that probably in a couple of weeks, Trump's going to pull ICE out of Minneapolis because this situation is untenable. And the administration is going to say, hey, mission accomplished. We did it. We arrested all these bad guys. And then they'll go do something else. And we will all forget about this because something else is going to happen that we're all going to be yelling about.
Right. So I think, obviously, the news cycle moves incredibly fast these days, and we always talk about, oh, is X going to affect the midterms 6 months in advance? And it usually doesn't because the news cycle moves on. I return to the mass shootings kind of analogy. I think those things, again, for better or for worse, they tend to fade from the headlines pretty quickly. I think if you're asking me, will the shooting of Alex Pretti and Renee Good specifically affect the midterms? I think no, for the reasons that Mary said. But I think if, Trump is still doing this level of immigration enforcement in Minneapolis or in other cities in the fall, it'll still very much be a live issue, and that will kind of affect the general mood that people have going into the ballot box. As you guys know, I tend to believe in kind of more structural factors and don't necessarily think that people are being like, oh, this one issue, yes, this is the thing I'm going to vote, deciding my vote on. But yeah, I think like Venezuela, frankly, I think that when we had that discussion, I don't think we were like, oh yeah, it's definitely going to affect the midterms. It was like, well, if this is the beginning of prolonged American involvement in Venezuela, then that will be a campaign issue. But if this is all it is and it was one strike and then we, forget about it, then it wouldn't be. So I think it kind of is similar here.
I'm not just doing this for the sake of providing conflict on this podcast, but I think I disagree.
Okay.
Because this is not, we already know that this is not a singular event, right? Concerns about immigration enforcement had already been on the increase, and approval of Trump's handling of immigration had already been on the decline for a year heading into this event. Mm-hmm. Already, immigration enforcement had been relatively high profile. Already, we'd seen backlash amongst, for example, Donald Trump did very well for a Republican with Latino voters in 2024. Already, we had seen that amongst Latino voters, they had turned against him and turned against him harshly on the issue of immigration, although not border security. And so a lot of these trends, I think, were already in the works. And this is a high-profile, focusing event that will become representative of a broader failure of the Trump administration. More like hurricane, whatever. We always come back to these historical analyses, but Hurricane Katrina did not tank Bush's approval rating because of a one-off horrible natural disaster event that, yes, had a bad federal response. It was a focusing event that became emblematic of what Americans had already seen as the failures of the Bush administration in Iraq and in the economy, wherever. And so this is a particular instance where, we got a question from a listener that I'll just read for the sake of maybe emphasizing this point. Stephen says, I'm recalling the discussion you had recently on the pod about how nurses were viewed as the most trustworthy profession and how damaging the victim blaming in the Pretti shooting by high-ranking admin officials could potentially be. So yes, on a previous podcast, we talked about how 75% of Americans view nurses as having high levels of, ethical standards and being trustworthy.
That's a great
Now,
point.
that's just one piece of this. This also incorporates Second Amendment rights, First Amendment rights. You have the NRA pushing back, saying, no, we need to do a full investigation just because you're armed. Especially, he was legally carrying his firearm. He had a permit to carry. Just because you're armed and you're at a protest does not mean that you are breaking the law. We mentioned a couple of Republicans who are pushing back, but we're seeing also from across the conservative pundit landscape, people also pushing back on the administration in this instance. This person is a highly sympathetic character. You've already seen videos of him reading memories about providing care for veterans at the VA hospital in Minneapolis. So I think that this is not a capture Maduro type event that seems to land on us out of nowhere just as we're coming back from the holidays. This is long-running trend that all of a sudden has an extremely sympathetic symbol of sort of what has gone wrong. And so I'm inclined to think that, is this going to be Americans' number one issue in November of 2026? No. Like, I mean, I doubt it. Whatever. I have no idea what's going to happen between now and then. Will this, I think, become emblematic of like the withdrawal from Afghanistan when really the bottom started to fall out for Biden, for example? I am inclined to think that it's possible.
Look at Galen being the least cynical one.
Yeah, well. Yeah, that was compelling. I think, yeah, I mean, we ultimately don't know, and I do think so much will depend on what the kind of issue environment is in the fall. But yeah, you're right. I think that it could be one of those focusing moments that is, maybe not. I don't think, again, that literally people are going to be thinking about, well, some people will be thinking about, this particular month of shootings when walking into the voting booth, but it could create the environment in which it's difficult for Trump to come back on immigration.
All right. Well, I'm inclined to just end the podcast there since you
agree
with my take.
I'm saying I'm uncertain. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, but yeah, good point.
All right. Well, of course, as with all of these stories, we will continue to cover them. But I want to say a big thank you, especially to Nathaniel and Mary, who engaged with me on Sunday to come together to cover this story and also agreed to start recording at 8:30 in the morning. So it would work with all of our schedules. There's only two people I think to go to when big news is happening, and you guys are it. So thank you so much for joining me, especially on a difficult topic to discuss.
Thanks, Galen.
Thank you, Galen.
My name is Galen Druk. Remember to become a subscriber to this podcast at gdpolitics.com and wherever you get your podcasts. Paid subscribers get about twice the number of episodes and can join in the paid subscriber chat and pass along questions for us to discuss on the show. Most importantly, you ensure that we can keep making a podcast that prioritizes curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. Also, be a friend of the podcast and give us a 5-star rating, maybe even tell a friend about us. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.